and welcome. It's wonderful to have you all here. My name is Ali Boutros, and this afternoon I will share results from my Capstone project, which focused on advancing community-led kelp restoration in California. So I've been extremely fortunate to have grown up along the California coast and started surfing and scuba diving at a very young age. It was this immersion into coastal ecosystems that really sparked my passion and curiosity for the ocean. I studied marine biology and loved diving deep into the world of natural sciences. But at the same time, I've also always been passionate about understanding the human-environmental connection. When I started this program, I thought I would be approaching kelp restoration from more of a natural sciences perspective. However, I quickly learned that I had been missing a central component of the story, and that was community. So I shifted gears and instead designed a study that would focus on the human elements of kelp restoration in California. And this is the story that I'm very excited to share with you all today. So to ground us, I first wanted to provide some basic kelp forest ecology. In California, we have two types of dominant canopy-forming kelps: bull kelp, which can be found north of Santa Cruz, and giant kelp, which can be found south of Santa Cruz. So why are kelp forests important? They're like the rainforests of the ocean. They're an extremely important foundational species, acting as both the home and food for hundreds of species. They also help to produce the oxygen that we breathe. In Northern California, we have one remaining natural predator of the red and purple sea urchin, the sunflower sea star, pictured top left. The sunflower sea stars eat urchins, keeping their populations in check, and then the urchins passively graze on bull kelp. However, in 2013, we had an outbreak of sea star wasting disease, which led to the near extinction of the sunflower sea star in California. Then, from 2014 to 2016, the Eastern Pacific, including the California coastline, experienced the largest marine heat wave ever recorded. So the loss of the sunflower sea star, coupled with the effects from the marine heat wave, led to an outbreak of purple sea urchins, ultimately leading to a 96% loss of bull kelp in Sonoma and Mendocino counties, and this loss has persisted today. In Central California, there are two natural predators of the purple and red urchin: the southern sea otter and the sunflower sea star. These predators hunt the red and purple sea urchin, keeping their populations in check, and then the urchins passively graze on giant kelp. Like Northern California, we saw an outbreak of purple sea urchins following the loss of the sunflower sea star in 2013 and the marine heat wave, which lasted from 2014 to 2016. In Central California, there was also significant kelp loss. However, unlike Northern California, we saw patchy mosaics of kelp loss and about a 70% reduction of giant kelp along the Monterey-Carmel Peninsula area. Like Northern California, this loss has persisted today, and this is the real impetus for kelp restoration in the state: the fact that we have lost so much kelp and that it is yet to recover. So as a result, we have many organizations, groups, and agencies who are trying to figure out whether and how to approach different methods of kelp restoration. Of the many groups involved are the Nature Conservancy and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, both of which are my partner practitioners. Specifically, Tristan and Noosh McHugh from TNC, who spearheads many of their kelp restoration initiatives, and Dr. Kristen Elsmore from CDFW, who is leading the development of the Kelp Restoration and Management Plan. My findings will be used to inform both of their respective work streams. So it has become increasingly apparent that community-led or community-involved restoration is critical to effective habitat restoration. Among many other factors, this is because it employs local knowledge and expertise to creatively problem solve and innovate. It incorporates community into the decision-making process, strengthening the long-term sustainability of restoration initiatives. And lastly, it helps to build collective impact between community, environmental nonprofit, and government agencies. However, the question still remains: what are the key attributes of effective community-led restoration, and how are they applicable to kelp restoration? So I employed a two-pronged approach to this project. I first dove into the literature to understand the key elements of community-engaged habitat restoration. I then applied these attributes to two empirical case studies to determine their presence or their absence and whether or not there were other important elements to consider. These are the results of part one. From the literature, I identified 6 key attributes of community involvement in habitat restoration. First, that community participants are involved in multiple facets of the project. Second, that community participants are involved from the onset of the project during decision-making processes. Third, that community participants are engaged throughout restoration. Fourth, that participants from the community, government agencies, and environmental nonprofits all bring diverse types of knowledge to the project. Fifth, that those participants have a shared understanding of the goals of restoration. And lastly, that there is collective impact and positive relations between community participants and other restoration practitioners. And I will be referring to these key attributes later on in my presentation. Now to address part 2. I conducted a comparative case study analysis of 2 experimental, community-led kelp restoration efforts in California, one in Mendocino County at Casper Cove and one in Monterey County at Tinker's Reef. I employed a mixed methods approach, including literature review, archival research, participant observation, and semi-structured interviews. The purpose of these 2 efforts is to understand whether or not the recreational community can decrease and then manage urchin populations at a certain threshold density. So according to the Fish and Game Commission, these efforts are considered experimental and both are operating under a temporary regulation change. So Tinker's Reef actually sunsetted in April of this year, and Casper Cove will sunset in April of 2029. These efforts are governed, so to speak, by California Code of Regulations, Title 14, Section 29.06, which states that at Casper Cove, recreational divers with a sport fishing license may take an unlimited number of purple sea urchin while skin or scuba diving, and at Tinker's Reef, recreational divers with a sport fishing license may take an unlimited number of purple and red sea urchin while skin or scuba diving. I then conducted archival research using publicly available Fish and Game Commission meeting documents from the years 2017 to present day to document the ecological, social, and legal genesis of these 2 efforts. And while I don't have time to share the nitty-gritty of this timeline, there are a few important findings that I want to share. First and foremost, because of the way that kelp forests are so deeply intertwined with communities, livelihood, and well-being, kelp loss had impacts that spanned beyond the physical ecosystem. There were social and cultural implications as well as economic losses. Specifically, the closure of the Northern California recreational red abalone fishery and the degradation of the Northern California commercial red sea urchin fishery were catalysts to these efforts. And 2 community members from each respective part of the coast emerged as leaders on behalf of their communities. It was citizen political advocacy, spearheaded by those 2 individuals, which led to both emergency and regulation changes adopted by the Fish and Game Commission, which enabled experimental restoration activities. And lastly, while the citizen political advocacy was spearheaded by those community members, the subsequent planning, implementation, and execution were the result of community, environmental nonprofit, and government collaboration. So at Casper Cove in Mendocino County, I was able to identify all 6 of those key attributes in the effort. I also found that there was high agency and project personnel turnover in the years leading up to and throughout Casper Cove efforts. And turnover is significant because it can impact message sharing and subsequently relationships. I also found that the perspectives of individuals impacted their specific perception of program goals. And at Casper Cove, there was a clearly identified community leader who helped to liaison the community group with environmental nonprofits and state agencies. However, there wasn't a clear singular leader for the entire effort, which at times complicated certain decision-making processes. And lastly, participants stated both social and ecological goals. At Tinker's Reef in Monterey County, I was also able to identify all 6 of those key attributes in the effort. And like Casper Cove, I found that there was a certain degree of agency and project personnel turnover in the years leading up to and throughout the efforts. I also found that perspectives of individuals affected their perception of program goals, and participants at Tinker's Reef stated both social and ecological goals. I also found that increased engagement by some community members led to an increased sense of ownership and connectedness to the effort. And at Tinker's Reef, there was a clearly identified leader who represented community participants and the effort as a whole. And lastly, I found that participation in one community-involved projects could perhaps facilitate or lead to participation in other community-led initiatives. For example, the crossover between Tankers Reef volunteers and Reef Check citizen science volunteers. So upon comparing these two efforts, I found important differences. As I mentioned earlier, the North Coast is dominated by bull kelp, which is an annual species, and the Central Coast is dominated by giant kelp, which is a perennial species. In terms of kelp loss on the North Coast, we saw that continuous 96% bull kelp loss in Sonoma and Mendocino County, whereas the Monterey-Carmel Peninsula area had patchy mosaics of kelp loss and about a 70% reduction in giant kelp. These environmental parameters undoubtedly translate to different implications for restoration. In terms of accessibility, the North Coast has more severe weather and less access to the coast. Therefore, there are less diveable days per year on the North Coast than the Central Coast. On the North Coast, we have the presence of recreational and commercial fisheries, unlike the Central Coast, and this has impacts for the types of people who participate in each respective effort, as well as their motivation to participate in efforts. And lastly, Tankers Reef efforts were tightly structured, whereas Casper Cove was more loosely structured. And this demonstrates that structure and function of efforts is highly dependent on the specific situation and needs. In terms of similarities, like I mentioned, I was able to identify all 6 of those key attributes in each case study. And this is significant because it demonstrates a level of applicability and importance at the empirical level, in addition to that literature theoretical level. I also found that more than 3/4 of community participants I interviewed indicated a consistent or increasing level of involvement. And this is significant because in community-led or involved restoration projects, maintaining a sustained volunteer workforce can be one of the most challenging aspects. However, this finding suggests that there is sustained participation, and therefore the restoration projects are more likely to be sustainable over the long term. At both efforts, community participants were involved at the onset and subsequently throughout. So participation at the onset specifically ensures that values are heard and integrated during decision-making processes. At both efforts, there was clear and consistent communication, both within and across groups, suggesting that communication was essential in sustaining interest and participation in the project. Both efforts had a certain degree of agency and project personnel turnover, and turnover can create opportunities and challenges. However, I did find that in these 2 case studies, it did appear to have created some challenges as it was an impediment to communication and relationship building. With both efforts, there was a clear community leader who helped to liaison between the community group and environmental nonprofits, in addition to governmental agencies. Both efforts had a project advisory board, which consisted of community members, environmental nonprofits, and government agency staff. And in this case, this provided opportunities and benefits as the members were able to provide advice and help with troubleshooting. At both efforts, perspectives impacted perception of goals. So you may recall that one of my key attributes was that all participants should have a shared understanding of program goals. And while this is true, it should perhaps be more nuanced to include that, yes, participants should have a shared understanding, but the way that participants actually perceive and therefore execute goals will vary depending on their perception and their perspective. At both efforts, participants indicated that social outcomes were important. For example, level of engagement, ways to engage or participate, awareness of the environmental problem, building community or camaraderie. And I didn't actually find this in the literature, but it's very important in community-led or involved restoration, especially with ecosystems like kelp forests that are so highly interconnected with the well-beings of communities. So what does this mean for future community-led kelp restoration? In terms of structure, it could be beneficial to have 2 to 3 community members who represent leadership for the entire effort. And 2 to 3 makes the effort less vulnerable if someone needs to step down, and also ensures that decisions represent more diverse opinions and values. It could also be helpful to have a project advisory group consisting of select members from the community, involved environmental nonprofits, and government agencies. And we saw this with both Tankers Reef and Casper Cove, and it was extremely helpful with troubleshooting, communication, and building relationships. Especially with ecosystems that are so highly interconnected with human well-being, there must be both ecological and social metrics of success or goals outlined for restoration. And lastly, while turnover is natural, ensuring transparency and frequent communication can help to offset its potentially negative impacts. In terms of impact of this work, I recently had the opportunity to present a subset of my findings at KelpFest in Mendocino, and it was really great to be able to contextualize my findings and to share back with some of the very people who have been so impacted by kelp loss. As I mentioned earlier, I am hopeful that some of my findings will be incorporated into the development of the kelp restoration and management plan. And I was also invited to be a co-author on a paper and also to contribute to a policy brief about coastal habitat restoration. So I will be working on both of these projects over the summer. I've also been chatting with folks from Kelp Forest Alliance, which is a global platform for kelp restoration and conservation, about collaborating or housing the results of my study. And lastly, while these two case studies were kelp specific, I do think that there are important lessons learned that can be applied to different ecosystems. Thank you so much to everyone who made the last 2 years so meaningful and transformative. Of course, thank you to the Coastal Science and Policy Program, specifically Anne, Sarah, and Holly, as well as all of the faculty. Dr. Mark Carr and Dr. Carrie Pomeroy, my two faculty co-advisors, thank you for your support, your mentorship, and dare I say, your therapy over the last 2 years. And of course, my partner practitioners, Tristan and Kristen, thank you for your guidance and your eagerness to collaborate with me. Thank you to the Sustainable Ocean Alliance and the Environmental Defense Fund's Leadership for Climate Resilient Fisheries Fellowship for the capacity building experiences as well as the financial support. Thank you to the Aspen Institute Future Climate Leaders Initiative for the capacity building opportunities, and thank you to the Institute of Marine Sciences and the Dean's Travel Grant for your financial support. And perhaps most importantly, thank you to the communities on the North and Central Coast who welcomed me with open arms and supported me in my research endeavors. Without your willingness to let me understand the important work you do, this project would not have been possible. And lastly, thank you to my cohort who has become like family to me. And with that, I will close the presentation and welcome any questions that you have. Thank you so much.